Okay, so without further ado then, Teresa Treat is going to be talking to us about strengthening integration, the theme for the first session today. So, Teresa.
Good morning. I talk better when I walk. So, before we get started, I'd like to ask everybody who's on the planning committee to stand up. Everybody who's on the planning committee to stand up. These people have done an enormous amount of work for many, many months, if not years, to do this together. And there's one of us who's not standing up right now, who is Cindy E. Bradbury, who is sick after a long, long time of working on this. And so I just wanted to take a minute to acknowledge your contribution to making this happen, the visionary nature of what you've put together here for all of us, and I think we need to give them a round of applause. Okay, so I'm delighted that we have a chance to wrestle today with one of my favorite topics, which is strengthening integration in clinical science training. And I want to acknowledge at the outset that I'm a member of the review committee for PCSAS, which of course informs the kinds of things that I'll be saying today. One of the super cool things you get to do as a review committee member is go to your programs and see what amazing things that you're doing, what innovative ideas you have, and things like that. So some of that's going to feed into some of the comments that I have today. But I want to be clear at the outset that I'm not speaking for the review committee, not speaking for PCSAS. So when we think about challenges facing provision of evidence-based mental health care in the United States, we're all very familiar with these. I want to acknowledge before listing them here, though, a key set of clinical scientists who over the years have had a really significant influence on the way that I think about a variety of issues that we'll be talking about today. So the first challenge is obviously our incomplete knowledge of psychopathology assessment and treatment, our very poor dissemination and implementation of existing prevention and treatment approaches, the marked disparities in the accessibility of appropriate mental health care for broadly diverse individuals, related in part to pervasive prejudice and discrimination operating from individual to systemic levels. The other things we'll focus on some is that many of our frontline providers are not adequately trained to provide evidence-based psychological treatments. Clinical psychologists are more likely to receive evidence-based training on average than those in other disciplines, but we're less likely increasingly to be frontline service providers. We are, however, extremely well trained to work a level or two up in clinical care contexts and have a broader impact through dissemination, implementation, public policy, etc. So clinical science doctoral internship training is designed to help address these challenges, to move the needle in terms of public health, but we've made limited progress in the enhancement of public health. So from my perspective, clinical science training is ideally designed to do three primary things, to prepare grads to do three primary things. One is to engage in the ongoing generation of new knowledge or research. The second is to provide scientifically grounded clinical care, fundamentally important to what we're doing in clinical science. We have to be able to function independently in clinical context at the conclusion of clinical care. That's critical, not just so we can get licensed or so we can do our research, but because it informs the way that we think about psychopathology and public health, the kinds of things that we do in our labs. The third thing is the engagement in significant widespread dissemination of scientific knowledge beyond frontline service provision. And this is in no way to minimize frontline service provision, but just to suggest that there's a really important role for the kinds of students that we're training in our clinical science programs to do formal training of trainers or other service providers, to do program development and evaluation across a wide variety of contexts and settings, to do public policy work that often involves development and evaluation of programs, clinical administration that may also involve development and evaluation, training components, teaching, science-based publications, presentations, etc. There's a wealth of things that our graduates are well prepared to do, but that we don't talk much about in clinical science programs. So when we think about the evolution of clinical science training, originally we were talking about the importance of research training and application training in doctoral all the way to internship, especially academy-like internship programs. It's individualized, it's flexible, it's innovative, it's multidisciplinary, it's scientific at its foundation. It's also integrated and bidirectionally influential, although we see across clinical science programs a wide variety in how integrated and how bidirectionally influential our programs are. In the last 10 to 15 years, clinical science training also increasingly is incorporating training in diversity in a more central way, broadly construed, equity, inclusion, and social justice, or DEIJ. This is critically important given the nature of the public health challenges that we're facing and the pervasive social injustices in our society. DEIJ was initially fairly siloed, like on the left, phase 2. But increasingly is integrated again to varying degrees with research and application training across clinical science programs. What's next? Ideally, I know of only 2-3 programs that do this really, really well, just from my perspective. We wipe out the silos, we drain the moats. The 3 components are essentially merged and bidirectionally influential. Clinical science, doctoral, and internship programs vary a lot in our degree of integration, reciprocity of influence, other kinds of sort of core aspects that we might add here. But this phase 4 training, I think, is what sets us up to think about moving the needle in terms of public health. And a lot of this, many of our programs are not doing as fully as we potentially could, in part because of resource issues, time issues, et cetera. So I want to just give you a minute to think about 3 questions to yourself. How would you depict your doctoral or internship training program as it currently operates, if you had to draw the schematic for yourself? You may want to take this back to your programs and have a discussion. How would you depict your program if it operated ideally? Why do you think that this operation would be ideal, specifically with respect to the enhancement of public health? What gets in the way of your ideal program operation? What would help you to move in the direction of your ideal program if it were feasible? Phase 4 clinical science training across running the gamut from doctoral to internship programs seems well suited to producing more graduates who would develop and broadly disseminate scientifically grounded, accessible, cost-effective, and adaptable mental and behavioral health services to a highly diverse population. So the training model's on the left. What we want to do is on the right, just from my perspective. What gets in the way? All kinds of things get in the way. I'm just going to focus on 3 things here. Siloing, or some degree of siloing, and or devaluing of research, application, or DEIJ training. Some faculty only do research training, interact little with their mentees about service provision training and DEIJ, and appear to place limited value on both. Some of our faculty only do service provision training and DEIJ training, interact little with other faculty and students about research training and activities, and often feel undervalued and undervalued and underappreciated. DEIJ sometimes is taught only in an isolated course, and it can be an amazing course, okay? Sometimes taught only in an isolated course or in isolated sections of courses or didactics. So we have diversity week, right? Okay, or we have a diversity session in each of the different courses that we might teach, for example, training experiences. But DEIJ is often poorly integrated into our research training, and it's often integrated into our application training to a more limited degree than it could be. Okay, we're focusing on opportunities here while also acknowledging some of the challenges and barriers. Okay? Another major barrier, this is a biggie from my perspective, is limited attention to significant widespread dissemination. We're not going to move the needle unless we really invest in dissemination and implementation. Some faculty and students at many clinical science programs seem largely unaware of the role of significant widespread dissemination in the clinical science model. Some faculty and students seem largely unaware of career goals for clinical scientists beyond mini-me's, right? And full-time service provision, okay? And these are both really important career trajectories, but they're not the only ones. And sometimes programs provide limited discussion of and training in dissemination and implementation science, or they just leave it to the people on their faculty who happen to work in that area, so it's siloed to the lab rather than cutting across the program. Although critically, D&I is important to having a public health impact, and we all should be thinking about it, even if we're doing the most basic of clinical science work. We need to place it in that broader context. Finally, students in our programs who decide not to pursue research-focused careers exist. We all bring in students in part because they want to be able to make significant research contributions, and sometimes they change their minds. Or sometimes there are financial constraints or family constraints, structural constraints, okay, that mean they need to be on a different trajectory. What do we do with these students? They may decide to pursue full-time careers in frontline service provision, in part because they know little about the wealth of other career options or the role of significant widespread dissemination in the clinical science model. And it shouldn't happen for those two reasons. I don't want to imply here that frontline service provision is unimportant. It's critically important. We don't move the needle without really increasing the caliber of our frontline service provision. The question is about the role of many, but not all, clinical scientists in that. So my point is that our clinical science grads are also very well prepared to work a level or two up in clinical context, in school context, in neighborhood context, and have a broader public health impact. Our students don't know about these career paths unless we talk about them, unless we place value on them, and unless we respect the importance of high quality and appropriately constrained clinical training within doctoral and internship programs. Third barrier. Faculty in clinical science programs sometimes indicate, imagine most of us in this room might, that we would like to be able to do more to address some of these barriers mentioned and the wealth of others that we've been discussing for the last day, but things get in the way. Well, one of the things that gets in the way is, I don't know this, right? I don't have the skills to do this. I don't know. The students know more than I do about DEIJ, okay? How can I stand up as an imposter, right? That doesn't make me feel very good. I'll let other people do it, okay? Another issue, lacking the necessary resources. So I want to be able to infuse DEIJ into my assessment course. How do I do that, right? You know, are there great syllabi I can take a look at? Are there videos that I can watch that would be really helpful? How would I'm going to take hours and go somehow find that material and things like that, incorporate it into clinical science training, okay? And so the other major thing that I hear over and over again is that faculty, especially in the last 5 years, are exhausted, burned out, and really struggling in terms of their own well-being in the midst of also trying to give themselves fully to clinical science training and work with our students to advance their careers and their well-being. Soliciting resources from generous experts across clinical science, doctoral, and internship programs that are organized and maintained well by national organizations, and I'm looking at the academy, will be key to addressing these issues. That's a heck of a lot of work, but I just don't know how we get there without something like that. So, how can we strengthen integrated clinical science training? So this section draws some on things that all of us are already doing and some on things that I've been on site visits or read, papers and things like that and been, wow, that's a great idea, okay? So research training, and here I'm focusing in particular on opportunities for research mentors because that's one of the topics that we'll be discussing in a work group after this. So first, think about what we have an opportunity to do as mentors. Obviously, to encourage integrative, innovative research training, bridges disciplines, runs the gamut from basic clinical science to dissemination and implementation, core to the clinical science model. But many of us still have siloed this as mentors, and we focus on our part of the dimension that runs the gamut from basic clinical science training to DEI, and we focus here in our lab, or we focus here in our lab. Very few labs talk, at least. They may not do the research that runs the full gamut, but talk about it and encourage our mentees, our collaborators, to think about the clinically relevant and health relevant phenomena of interest to us that run the whole gamut. It's a stage model. As mentors, we have the opportunity to understand and articulate the value of application training within clinical science models with appropriate caps and constraints, okay? We need to ask our mentees, how's clinical training going? I know you're doing assessment this year. How's it going? How is that, related to or potentially informing the way that you think about the questions of interest to you in a research context, right? How is it relevant to that gamut that runs from basic clinical training to I&D? We can ask those questions. We should ask those questions. We can obviously serve as teachers of applied material, as clinical practicum supervisors, as direct providers of services. We also can model the consideration of the role of DEIJ in conceptualization, assessment, and disseminable treatment of studied clinical phenomena in the same way that I think every clinical science research mentor should be talking about the gamut running from basic science to D&I. We need to be talking about and having our students write about and articulate what the role of DEIJ is in the clinically relevant or health relevant phenomena of interest to them. We can model that, and we can ask our students to do that. We can also actively support advancement of our program's DEI values in a variety of different kinds of ways. We can't all do all of these things, but many clinical science faculty can do one, if not two. We also can have open and respectful periodic discussions of mentees' career goals and progress in the program, recognize and respect that their interests may shift to be more clinically focused, and discuss career options in significant widespread dissemination as well as frontline service provision with respect. We can, from an application training perspective, ensure that all of our clinical application activities provide in-model training, and trainees have opportunities to work with diverse populations related to their research interests. Almost all the programs are doing this at this point, to varying degrees. We can collect, examine, act on data in all clinical care, make it available for research when possible in our in-house clinics or developing practice research networks, et cetera. We can infuse DEIJ into all aspects of application training. I think a particularly important part of this that is not necessarily done at all of our programs is articulating the role of our own or our mentees' and clients' individual differences in application activities, right? So tying the I&D and the DEIJ to what we do, what's important to us, where I want to go, what my career looks like, how am I going to make a difference, right? And putting DEIJ and I&D in the center of that. We also can consider whether more advanced students might be able to do practicum training that wouldn't necessarily be in model with populations of primary interest or in settings or conditions of primary interest if clinical science faculty provide supplemental supervision. We have amazing graduate students. By the time they're in their fourth year, many of them can go into a community setting and make a wealth of difference in terms of potentially helping to train the people who might already be there in appropriate ways with the appropriate guidance and oversight of somebody from the clinical science faculty. Okay? Several of our programs are doing this. Provide some service provision training in relevant research labs and doctoral programs. So I've seen a handful of programs doing this. When the students are learning about early assessment or early treatment, for example, with anxiety, depression, things like that, then they might rotate through for a semester or for a 6-week period different research labs where they might have NIH or NIJ funding to do some of these kinds of activities, and they learn and receive feedback in those research contexts, right? And this is a way also of bringing in those faculty who might not be clinically trained, right? So that you get that full integration again of the research and application training. We can incorporate D&I beyond supervision, not meaning to minimize supervision, but I think we often stop there, into application training in both our doctoral and internship training programs, in part, again, so that students can say, how is this relevant to my interests, right? To my values, to where I want to be in the long run, what I want to do, how I want to make a difference. We can ensure our basic didactics draw on service provision material, and a number of programs now are merging the didactic courses on things like assessment and treatment with service provision training, potentially over a full year, okay? So that all this happens together, might be taught by 2 people simultaneously, okay? We can incorporate evaluation of application expertise into one or more milestones in doctoral programs. Several of the clinical science programs around the country, especially in the area of comps, I've just seen such cool things where they're starting to evaluate application expertise in the context of comps. Supplemental statements, right? Supplemental presentations, things like that, but that serve to integrate application training with both research training and DEIJ. We can ensure that key faculty doing service provision training are appreciated, recognized, and appropriately compensated for their important work, and I can't underscore this enough. DEIJ training opportunities. We've talked about this a fair amount already, so I'm just going to move through this. We can strengthen our training in the role of diversity, other individual differences, and multi-level sociocultural factors in psychopathology, assessment, research methods, and training. We can infuse DEIJ into research and application training, in part, again, so that our students can articulate why this is relevant to me, to my research, to my clinical interest, to what I want to do in the long run. Provide training in D&I. I think this is really important. That is intended in part to help prepare interested students to address widespread dissemination of evidence-based healthcare and marked disparities in healthcare. I think academy internships are particularly well positioned to do this, and sometimes I think we put it off to the internships, but it needs to start earlier if we're going to potentially get people thinking more about D&I, broader impact, what I do in the long run, et cetera. We can integrate evaluation of DEIJ expertise, again, into one or more milestones in our doctoral programs, and again, seeing this in a handful of programs with comps around the country. We can mentor and invest in the training of students from disadvantaged backgrounds, obviously at the doctoral level, postdoctoral level, but at the undergraduate level. Okay? In the pipeline programs, diversity weekends, things like that, that a number of the different programs across the country have now developed. We can assess, attend to, and respond to student issues related to program diversity, equity, climate, and well-being, while also taking care of ourselves and setting limits when we need to. So in closing, clinical scientists, from my perspective, engage in significant ongoing generation of new knowledge and/or significant widespread dissemination of clinical science. We work in a wide variety of different settings, but we don't talk about this a lot. Medical schools, neighborhoods, nonprofits, industry, clinical, university, government, school. So many places we can make a difference. And we engage in a wide variety of activities: teaching, training, research, service provision, program development, evaluation, supervision, public policy administration. Many of the things that we need to move the needle. So I think we're ideally positioned to potentially enhance public health. But in terms of how we get there from here, I think one of the most important things is to regularly discuss within our doctoral and internship program communities the breadth of the clinical science model and the diverse array of potential career outcomes that could enhance public health and help address marked health disparities. I think to the extent possible, we want to fully merge research application and DEIJ training, particularly in a way that the individual ties to themselves and what they're going to be doing in the long run, what's important to them, what they place value on. And I think it's really important to integrate dissemination and implementation into research, application, and DEIJ training. I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to move to doing the DEI, right? But it's relevant to what everybody in this room does, and we don't talk about it much. Finally, I think we need to thank national organizations for stepping up to solicit, curate, and maintain repositories of resources provided by clinical science faculty in doctoral and internship programs with expertise. I'm focused particularly on these areas, but there will probably be others: DEIJ, D&I, fully merged clinical science training. We see amazing things on the review committee, but how does the word get out to others, okay? So one of the roles, I've been mulling this the last, so I'm not committing to anything, but one of the roles that I think potentially we might be able to have the review committee play is that we see this stuff, right? You know, I see stuff and think, that is an amazing syllabus, or what a creative way of integrating this and that and the other kinds of things. But how do people find out about that? Obviously, you know, the review committee and the board would have to talk and things like that, and we'd have to get permission from programs. But it might be that the review committee, in part, could be one of the many feeders of some of those kinds of resources by flagging things that we think are particularly impressive with respect to Phase 4 training. Thank you very much.